Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. I'm your host, Sean, and this is another instalment in our Career Profiles series. This is all about a heavyweight from boxing history who probably isn't regarded as highly as some of the names like Jack Johnson, Jack Dempsey, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, Larry Holmes, even the likes of Lennox Lewis or Anthony Joshua or even Tyson Fury. This is about a fighter who, once he became heavyweight champion, he made his own destiny, he created his own legacy, and he also does, in my opinion, go down as one of the greats in boxing heavyweight history. This is the career profile of Floyd Patterson. We've got some great stories to tell on this episode about Floyd's beginnings, how it all began getting into the sport, how he went to the Olympics, how he started his pro career, and how his pro career developed into some memorable moments and memorable nights, some of them in infamy for him, but some of them very memorable for him as well. Now, if you haven't heard us talk about Floyd Patterson before, you can also listen to the tale of Patterson and Johansson on the Legendary Nights podcast feed. We did that around about a year or so ago, and you'll be able to listen to some of the great stories from that episode, which will act as a good episode to accompany this one. Now, before I get into the episode, I want to signpost all of the social media channels to follow us on. You can find us at BTR Boxing Podcast on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, and also on YouTube as well. Please make sure you've subscribed to us on YouTube, you've liked us on all the social media channels that we have. We are also available on X, so please make sure you are following us on there for the latest updates, the latest boxing news, of course, the latest podcasts that's coming from the network as well. So please make sure you do take a moment to have a look at that. If you're not subscribed to us on any of the podcasting platforms, you can do so on Apple, on Spotify, on Amazon Music, on Audible. We're pretty much on all the main podcasting apps out there. So please make sure you subscribe, leave us a rating, and leave us a review. It really, really does help us. And I want to take a moment to give a big shout out on Spotify to Stinky Limpy. Pretty funny username indeed, but Stinky Limpy, you give us some great feedback around how the shorter versions of the career profiles, i.e. parts 1, 2 and 3, is really helpful to consume. So we are going to continue to do that, and Floyd Patterson's career profile will be in multiple parts, of course, so that we can also give you a real in-depth career profile and not just try to cram in everything into that one episode. Well, without further ado, let's get into it. Now, let's begin by talking about Floyd Patterson's parents. First of all, his father, Thomas Patterson, who was known to be a real hard worker. People in Waco, North Carolina, they bore witness to that fact, as Thomas, he put in long, brutal hours on the Seaboard Airline railway line crew. But, like nearly all black Americans in the South, Thomas never saw much in return for his labour. In 1936, he had a growing family, including his 1-year-old baby, Floyd, who had been born on January the 4th of the previous year, and of course Thomas could have used some extra dollars. But there was not much opportunity to make money in Waco. It was a poor hamlet in a poor part of a nation suffering through the Great Depression. He and his wife Annabelle heard from relatives that things were better up north, so they decided to depart North Carolina with its poverty and its segregation and seek out a better life elsewhere. In the years following World War I, black Americans, like the Pattersons, they began abandoning the rural South by the hundreds of thousands to flee racism and seek jobs in the industrialised Northeast and Upper Midwest. Eventually, some 7 million people took part in this great migration, forever changing the cultural landscape of the United States. American popular music would never be the same because of the demographic shift, nor would politics, cuisine, literature, fashion, or sports. Thomas chose the Bedford-Stuyvesant area of Brooklyn as the new home for his family. Although blacks had lived in Brooklyn for more than 200 years, Bedford-Stuyvesant, with its gracefully brownstones and tree-lined streets, had been off limits to them for decades. But in the early 1900s, blacks began moving in to Bed-Stuy as New York's burgeoning population forced the breakdown of old barriers. It became one of the first urban areas in the United States to experience white flight, as property speculators used the growing black population to convince whites to sell their homes at prices far below even the depressed market values of the 1930s. The once stately houses in Bed-Stuy were then gutted and re-outfitted as cheap apartment houses. In 1930, fewer than 30,000 non-white residents lived in the neighbourhood, but that changed quickly with a wave after wave of black immigrants. Soon, Bed-Stuy was a large African-American ghetto. What Thomas Patterson found for his family in Bed-Stuy was different from what he'd known in North Carolina, but it would be hard to make the case that it was much of an improvement, at least as far as the family's livelihood was concerned. The Pattersons had simply traded small-town poverty for urban poverty. In Bed-Stuy, the sidewalks were crowded and discarded newspapers took flight with each gust of wind. The buildings were dingy, rapidly falling into disrepair and infested with roaches and other vermin. Crime was commonplace, and the family was forced to contend with street hustlers and gang members, something unheard of back in Waco. Yet Bed-Stuy was a place where blacks were free to speak much more openly than they could back in North Carolina. The Pattersons would have been exposed to the progressive concept of W.E.B. Du Bois and the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, also known as the NAACP, and to the street corner preachments of radicalised followers of Marcus Garvey, something that would have been unheard of in the South in the 1930s and 40s. However, the family's struggle to keep a roof overhead and food on the table overshadowed the lofty idealism surrounding them. The Pattersons fell into a pattern of frequent moves within Bed-Stuy as the family grew larger. Floyd remembered 6 or 7 apartments from his childhood, but there might have been more. All were 4 or 5 room dwellings known as railroad flats, apartments whose rooms are in a line with doors between them, not dissimilar to shotgun shacks in the South, with no running hot water, heated by coal or oil-fired stoves. Floyd said the only windows were in the rooms in the front and the back, and it was always too hot in the summer, too cold in the winter, and never big enough. To pay the rent on these shabby dwellings, Thomas Patterson worked long hours on construction crews for the city sanitation department as a longshoreman and at the mob-controlled Fulton Fish Market on the East River waterfront in Lower Manhattan. He was in his 40s, and the harsh physical requirements of these jobs took everything out of him. He came home at night exhausted and frustrated. Sometimes he skipped dinner and went straight to the bedroom, where he collapsed into sleep, still wearing his work clothes. Every Friday, he handed all of his pay to Floyd's mother for household expenses. But his work week wasn't over. He took odd jobs on weekends to bring in a little more cash. I felt very, very sorry for my father, Floyd remembered. I'd see him go out to work at 6 in the morning and come home sometimes at 1 the next morning. Some days he'd take a drink when it was cold outside. After he got home, I was the one who would take off his shoes and clean his feet. I enjoyed it. Annabelle also worked first as a maid, then later at a bottling plant. With both parents employed, the Patterson children were on their own most of the day. They, like other neighbourhood children, had plenty of opportunity for getting into trouble on the streets. Fights, often involving clubs and knives, were common. Fruit carts and stores provided temptation for shoplifting. But the young Floyd Patterson had problems beyond those of a typical ghetto kid. Problems that mystified his parents, his teachers, and ultimately himself. There was a photograph hanging on the wall in the Patterson home which showed Floyd at age 2 during the trip to Bronx Zoo with his brothers Frank and Billy. As Floyd grew older, he frequently stared at the picture, silent rage building inside him. He would point to the photo and shout to his mother, "I don't like that boy." Annabelle Patterson had no idea what caused these outbursts. Her son's obsession with the image eventually took a darker turn when Floyd carved an X over his face in the photo, shocking his mother, who could not understand what would provoke such a destructive act. Nor could she understand her son's odd nightmare behaviour. Nightmares and screaming fits were regular occurrences. He also began sleepwalking, sometimes strolling the busy sidewalk outside the apartment house in his pyjamas. The sleepwalking alarmed his parents so much that they took Floyd to a doctor, something that would not have been undertaken lightly given the family finances. The doctor charged the office visit fee, but offered no remedy. When Floyd started elementary school, his troubles only increased. He was convinced the other kids were making fun of him. He saw himself as the perfect butt for jokes, a tall, skinny, gawky kid with a grimy face. His hand-me-down clothes were oversized, his shoes were too big for his feet, cuffed trousers with a waistband drawn tight with a belt to keep them from falling down, and a shirt so large it flapped in the breeze. Beyond his appearance, Floyd knew there were other reasons for people trying to ridicule him. His social skills were all but non-existent. He couldn't bring himself to talk to other people, nor could he look anyone in the eye. Floyd quickly fell behind the other students. He went from one year to another without learning how to read or write, though later IQ tests showed him to be of average intelligence. Even when he knew the answer, Floyd didn't raise his hand in class, not wanting to call attention to himself. Teachers had little opportunity to get to know him. He once estimated that he attended as many as 10 Brooklyn elementary schools because of the family's frequent address changes. The schools he went to in the area, Jimmy Breslin once wrote in his popular newspaper column, have old, faded record cards showing he attended 9 days in one of them, a couple of weeks in another. The rest of the time, he ran the streets, a strange, illiterate kid who would stick his chin on his chest and look at the ground when anybody tried to talk to him. Floyd didn't care about schoolwork or whether he was promoted to the next grade. At the same time, he despised himself for not caring. He sought out dark places to hide whenever he had the chance. Frequently, he hid in the school's cellar and stayed there until class was dismissed. The teachers became accustomed to this vacant desk of his. Eventually, he started skipping school altogether, especially Fridays, assembly day. School rules required him to wear a white shirt and tie on Fridays, and his only dress clothes were hand-me-downs from his father that were much too large for him. Floyd believed he looked like a character straight from a comic book. The other kids laughed at him even more so than usual, or so it seemed to Floyd. Plenty of Bed-Stuy kids had it just as tough as he did, but Floyd was blind to them. On those Fridays, he could see only the kids who were better off and register humiliation because he was not among them. As Floyd's truancies became more frequent, he began prowling the streets of Brooklyn, finding alleys or shadowy corners where he could be by himself. If he had the 18 cents for admission, he slipped into the comforting darkness of second-run Brooklyn movie houses like the Banco, the Regent or the Apollo. If he didn't have the 18 cents, he sneaked in. He might remain in the theatre all day and into the evening, staring raptly at the giant images on the screen before him. The white actors represented to him what normal life should be. People who lived in comfortable houses, families with well-mannered children, a father who didn't come home completely used up by his job. Sometimes he boarded the 8th Avenue subway and rode it all day. One day, he discovered a little room off the tracks near the High Street station. When no one was looking, he'd climb the metal ladder leading up to it and push open the door. The tiny enclosure housed tools used by subway crews. He'd step inside and close the door. Suddenly, it'd be in complete darkness, and it was silent in that room, except when a train roared past. Floyd felt safe there. No eyes peering at him, no voices talking about him. This tool closet became his refuge from the real world, a place where he'd spread old newspapers on the floor, lie down, and drift into dreams of candy, nice clothes and money. But he couldn't stay in his hole in the wall forever. Skipping school was a serious offence, and Floyd drew the attention of truant officers. He tried hiding from them, but they caught him often enough. He became familiar with courtrooms and judges. He pleaded with his mother to let him just quit school altogether. He fantasised that he could get a job, do a man's work, and supply badly needed income for the family. His mother would hear nothing of it. She adhered to the adage that staying in school meant staying out of trouble, so his fantasies of becoming a full-time worker evaporated. But he still skipped class as often as he could, and, as his mother feared, he found trouble. He regularly snatched fruit from delivery trucks as well as from the S&F stores at Sam's grocery. One night, he decided to burgle a shop to steal food. He took his booty to a corner 2 blocks away and began eating while sitting on a curb, convinced he'd pulled off his crime undetected. But he was wrong. A policeman soon nabbed him. Floyd was now off to juvenile court yet again, where authorities added the incident to what was becoming a growing record of truancy offences and petty crimes. Once, he stole for his mother. He saw female teachers wearing pretty clothes, but never Annabelle. He resented this, so he broke into a store at 2 a.m, grabbed an armload of dresses and ran out of the front door. I carried them all the way home, he said, taking special care when I had to jump over a wall. When my mother asked where I got the dresses, I told her I found them. His mother, of course, grew suspicious about the mounting number of things young Floyd supposedly found, but there was little she could do to stop him. His daring escalated. He even managed to steal a truck from the Sheffield Farms Milk Company and take it for a short joyride, though his legs were hardly long enough to reach the pedals. He ran home after abandoning the truck, with no one pursuing him. But he knew this act, like his other misdeeds, would catch up with him at some point. One day, the Bishops, a group of Bed-Stuy thugs, cornered Floyd on the street and tried to steal his pocket change. Outnumbered and smaller than his assailants, Floyd nonetheless flailed at them wildly until someone pulled a knife. Fortunately for Floyd, his older brother Frank happened along that moment. Frank grabbed a stick in the gutter and threatened the thugs who fled without Floyd's money. In fighting back, Floyd had tapped into a familiar well of rage within himself. It proved effective against the Bishops, but when it surfaced during a confrontation with a cop, Patterson's whole life changed. It started when Floyd snatched a case of soda from a bottling plant. As he hurried away, a police car pulled up. A whole case of soda was too much for a 10-year-old boy like Floyd to carry while running, so he dropped it, snatched 2 bottles and then took off again. But even those 2 bottles were too much to handle. He threw one aside. Then, after a few more steps, he tossed the other one away. He made it all of half a block before the policeman from the patrol car collared him. "You just robbed the factory down the street," the officer declared. "I saw you. Let's go." The patrolman led him back to the soda plant, where he tried to make Patterson confess. Floyd refused, claiming some other boy had given him the sodas, so the officer started slapping him around. The policeman also accused Floyd of hurling soda bottles at him. When Patterson began crying, the patrolman picked up an empty wooden crate and smashed it over Floyd's head. In that moment, everything changed. Floyd went from the reclusive, shy, quiet kid to being a crazy mad, as he later described it. Snatching up a crate himself, he attacked the officer. The patrolman later told Annabelle he'd never seen anything like it. Floyd had become a miniature wild man, screaming and fighting. It took 2 or 3 more cops to subdue him. The incident sent Floyd once again back to juvenile court, where he went before a judge who knew him all too well from previous appearances. Patterson stared at the floor as he listened to the judge tell Annabelle that he feared Floyd was headed towards more serious crimes. It was time to take some action, the judge said. The boy needed a more regulated life. Annabelle, she agreed. 10-year-old Floyd left the courtroom certain he was bound for prison. Patterson had good reason to assume he was going to jail. Where else could he have been headed to? Government-funded social services were all but unknown to Bed-Stuy citizens. The service providers that were prevalent had affiliations with churches and benevolent groups, and most chose not to deal with troubled African-American youths. But one alternative existed, one Annabelle Patterson learnt about from the courts. It sounded unreal, a facility in upstate New York where boys could find plenty of open spaces, woods, fresh air, and most important, teachers dedicated to inner city kids who battled internal demons. But the Wiltwyck School for Boys was real, and that was Floyd's destination as he departed Brooklyn in September of 1945, riding in a car driven by a school counsellor named Clarence Cooper. Cooper attempted conversation during the 90-mile drive to Esopus, the small town near Wiltwyck, but Patterson kept his eye closed and his lips locked, fuming to himself and angry at his mother. Cooper tried to reassure Floyd, telling him that he was travelling to a place that would help him, but Patterson was having none of it. He gave every indication that he planned to fight whatever awaited him to the very end. With his eyes clamped shut in the car, eventually he fell asleep. Patterson missed the startling changes in landscape as Clarence Cooper drove from Brooklyn up to Poughkeepsie, then across the bridge to Esopus. Had he been looking, Floyd would have taken in things he'd never seen before: mountains, forests, rivers, open fields, pastured horses. When the car finally came to a stop and he opened his eyes, Floyd saw 4 stone buildings trimmed with wood painted white. Behind them, wooded hills stretched into the distance. As he stepped out of the car, he was impressed by what he didn't see: bars, barbed wire crowned fences, guards with guns. He did see a lot of other boys, mostly his age and mostly black. The kids seemed to be dressed better than he. He was still in his outsized hand-me-downs, but from the very beginning, he felt like he could relate to them. He said, "One thing really astounded me. I found it didn't make any difference that I was coloured, the way it did in Brooklyn, where white boys called me names. There were about 30 white boys and 40 to 50 Negro boys at Wiltwyck, and they all got along. I never heard one remark about the colour of a boy's skin or his religion." Other Wiltwyck boys had different memories, but the school's equitable treatment of residents probably served to minimise racial tensions. As he settled in, Patterson learned that the standard form of a corporal punishment, common in public schools of the time, was discouraged at Wiltwyck, although some staff members were known to beat unruly students, and plenty of 10-year-old thugs were on campus to challenge the staff's authority. Each residential cottage had a counsellor and a trained social worker. A public school administered by the New York City Board of Education functioned on the grounds, and all the boys were required to attend. But the classroom atmosphere was far from different from what was typical in a city school. The class size was smaller, allowing teachers to devote more time to each of the students. The teachers themselves had made a conscious decision to work with emotionally troubled children, so they did not consider boys like Floyd to be a disruption or something to be endured. They had chosen to work with kids like him. Many of the teachers had remarkable backgrounds. Art instructor Edith Kramer had learned painting from masters in Vienna, where she had been born and reared. She befriended a number of the early psychoanalysts in Vienna and underwent therapy herself. In Prague in the late 1930s, she taught art for children of Jewish and communist refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. There, she helped pioneer the idea of art therapy for traumatised children. She eventually fled Hitler-controlled Europe herself and wound up at Wiltwyck, where she employed on-the-street kids from the New York techniques she'd first used with refugees in Prague. Miss Vivian Costin did not boast an exotic pedigree along the line of Kramer's, but she became one of the most important people in Floyd's life. Almost nothing exists in public records about Costin. She was African American and had never married. Census records indicate she may have been born in North Carolina in 1901 and lived in Connecticut before her Wiltwyck days. According to Patterson, she died sometime during the mid-1950s. Other than that, she's unknown. But there is one thing about her which is no mystery. Her influence on Patterson, it lasted a lifetime. Working with just 7 or 8 boys at a time in a classroom, Costin patiently attempted to bring them out of their shells and convince them that they could learn. One day, she asked a question of the class, but Floyd's lack of confidence kept him from responding. When Costin announced the answer, and Floyd discovered he had been right, he leaped from his chair and darted out of the classroom, furious with himself for not speaking up. When Coston caught up with him in the hallway and saw the tears streaming down his cheeks, she told Floyd she knew he'd known the answer. She said she wanted him to overcome his fear of speaking out, that he was no different from any other boy his age. From that point onward, Patterson began to risk speaking out in class. He was often wrong with his answers at the beginning, but newly engaged with his studies, he started to catch on. Soon as a reward, Coston invited him to spend a weekend at her house, a candy-sweetened honour she gave to the boy who had done the best academically. She also bought Floyd clothes and other small gifts. Patterson soon proved himself to be among the bright lights of Wiltwyck. As such, he developed key friendships with two prominent adults. Ernest Papanek, who later became the school director, was a well-known man of the world who had once been a member of the Vienna City Council and the Executive Committee of the Socialist Youth International, as well as a groundbreaking psychiatrist. He was best known for the work he'd done to protect Jewish children from the Nazi persecution during World War II. Floyd also befriended Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's widow. Wiltwyck, located just across the Hudson River from her Valkill home, existed only because of her ability to raise money for it. Justine Wise Polier, the first woman to serve as a judge in New York City and Roosevelt's friend, had convinced the Episcopalian Mission Society to create the Wiltwyck School for Boys, Esopus, in 1936. Wiltwyck began accepting disturbed boys referred from New York City, with the city paying the private school for its services. Most of the students were like Floyd Patterson, poor and black with criminal records and symptoms of mental illness. The school had its share of failures, and violence was fairly common among the students. Sometimes the staff reacted in kind when confronting offenders, but it also had its successes, boys whose lives were turned around by the Wiltwyck experience. Floyd caught Roosevelt's eye, and he was among the students invited to spend 2 Christmases at the Roosevelt Hyde Park estate. Those visits began a friendship that lasted until her death in 1962. The Wiltwyck experience eroded Patterson's cynicism and transformed him into something of a juvenile egalitarian. It also taught him that he was a natural when it came to smashing his fist into another kid's face. 3 or 4 times a year, Walter Johnson, Wiltwyck's executive director, staged boxing bouts for the boys, coaching them himself beforehand. With prodding from his mother during one of her Wiltwyck visits, Patterson agreed to give ring fighting a try. The first kid he boxed was bigger and had boxing experience, so Patterson doubted he could beat him, until the first round was underway. Floyd discovered that he could easily dominate his foe. He flattened the other kid's nose, and with that, Floyd had his first boxing victory. He showed little style in winning. In fact, he looked flat-out clumsy, leaping into the air to launch punches, throwing haymakers that missed the mark by feet, not inches. The boys in the audience howled at his missteps, but at the same time, they rooted for him and gave him a rousing ovation when he won. It was the first time he had ever heard a crowd cheer for him, and he loved it. He fought 2 more bouts while at Wiltwyck, and as the audience favourite, he won them both. Patterson left Wiltwyck at age 12, feeling like a winner for the first time in his life. During his 2 years at the school, he'd learnt to read and write. He'd overcome his paralysing shyness. He could look people in the eye and hold a conversation. The fits of screaming at night, they disappeared. He never again sleptwalked. He would come to understand his experience at the school as fostering in him the belief that ghetto-formed nihilism can be overcome, that hope exists for even the most downtrodden, that black people and white people can live and work together. Now he was ready to go back to New York City to finish his public school education. More importantly, he wanted to get back in the ring. He said, "My mind was already taken up with boxing." In the mid-1940s, many young black men and boys found their minds taken up with boxing. It was the one major sport that was integrated to any significant degree. Big League Baseball boasted not a single black player. Top-flight college football programs were almost without exception white. Black players turned up in the National Football League only sporadically, a situation that would not change until 1946, when the Los Angeles Rams signed African-Americans Woody Strode and Kenny Washington, a move that prompted other teams to add black players to their rosters as well. Professional basketball would not integrate until 1950. But blacks had been making their mark on boxing for decades. The most lauded athlete in the world immediately after World War II was the heavyweight champ Joe Louis from Detroit. Louis was the first African American to become a national hero, a status he acquired by hammering the German Max Schmeling in 1938's Battle of the Century fight. His private life was one thing, but his public persona was that of a clean-living, hard-working, respectable black man, and he inspired countless other young black men to pursue success inside the ring, not the least of whom were Frank, Billy, and Floyd Patterson. They started at the most basic of makeshift boxing gyms, Brooklyn's Carlton Avenue YMCA. It had virtually no training equipment except sparring gloves and a solitary speed bag hanging in a corner. It was all atties and elbows out there on the basketball court of the Carlton Avenue YMCA, where pairs of kids faced off and threw punches at each other, all of them going at it simultaneously. The boxing matches Floyd participated in at Wiltwyck had been wild exhibitions between untrained boys, but here he began to learn how to keep his hands up, how to feint jabs and how to slip punches thrown at him as he sparred round after round. It was akin to figuring out how to swim by being thrown into a deep lake, but it worked for Floyd and his brothers. Frank Lavelle, the trainer in charge of Carlton Avenue's boxing programme, took notice of the Patterson boys. They seemed to have potential. Lavelle, whose day job was at the US Custom House at the Port of New York, was not unlike other white trainers in big cities across the country. Boxing had been integrated as far back as the late 1800s, except for championship bouts. White promoters ensured that only white boxers competed in those. But that changed in 1902 when Joe Gans won the world lightweight title. While Gans's victory did not immediately create complete integration of championship-level boxing, it opened the door. More and more blacks appeared in the prize-fighting ring as the 20th century progressed, most taking up the sport as a way to escape poverty. After the war, as African-American fighters were becoming more and more dominant in the professional fight ranks, men like Lavelle prospected for future pro talent in gyms catering to blacks in poor neighbourhoods. If he could find a fighter capable of eventually winning some pro fights, Lavelle stood to make some money. As much as a third of a fighter's purse went to his manager and trainer. Lavelle didn't necessarily have to find a potential champion. In those days, before television became pervasive, pro boxing matches took place in auditoriums around the city every week, so there was plenty of demand for boxers, a few of whom earned a living from the ring without ever contending for a championship. Their managers and trainers made well enough out of it too. After a couple of years of working with the Pattersons at the YMCA, Lavelle decided it was time to take Frank and Billy to the next step. Floyd tagged along. That next step was the Gramercy Gym, which was situated across the river in Manhattan. It occupied a rundown space upstairs at 116 East 14th Street. The neighbourhood was familiar to Floyd. After leaving Wiltwyck, he began attending classes at the Cyrus W. Field School, a vocational elementary/junior high school, better known as PS 614. It was one of two 600 schools for maladjusted students that had recently opened in New York, and it was located on East 4th Avenue, not too far from the Gramercy. With their emphasis on teaching trades, the schools catered to students who stood little chance for academic advancement. Floyd excelled at PS 614, just as he had at Wiltwyck, but the Gramercy offered him the chance to learn skills that would prove far more valuable than any training he received at school. The boxing gym was also far more demanding. Just getting from the street to the gym involved a test of will. The street entrance was a heavy zinc-plated door on which had been painted Gramercy Gym, owing to a sign painter's careless ways. Before boys could get to the sparring ring and heavy bags upstairs, they had to open that big door. Some never could screw up enough courage to do so, fleeing instead to the candy stand next door, never to consider boxing. But some did continue. On the other side, past some garbage cans, were 2 flights of dimly lighted, rickety wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness. Who knew what really waited at the top? Climbing the stairs took even more courage. It was almost as if you were climbing the steps of the gallows, and many boys made it no farther than halfway up before they turned tail and hustled back to the candy stand. The boys who did make it all the way to the top encountered another door in the shadows. This last barricade dissuaded a few more. A square had been cut in the door and covered with chicken wire, and behind that square was a snarling German shepherd. That was enough to scare away even some tough kids. But those who braved the dog and pushed the door open entered a kind of dingy wonderland of sights, smells and sounds guaranteed to entice most boys, a wonderland lorded over by a stocky middle-aged man named Cus D'Amato. Floyd passed all of these tests of courage and entered the Gramercy gym for the first time, trailing Frank Lavelle and his brothers. The gym's size impressed Floyd. He thought it looked like the inside of a big barn. The odour of stale sweat clung to the walls, hardly pleasant, but oddly inviting evidence of serious work getting done. The windows were closed tight, they were never opened, and the air felt hot against Floyd's skin. He let his eyes travel around the enormous room. Men sparred in the ring. A couple of boxers slugged away at 2 heavy bags, and the hypnotic rat-a-tat-tat of speed bags drowned out conversations. Across the way, fighters shadow boxed in front of cracked mirrors. Someone who'd finished his workout lay face down on a table for rub-down. There were some steel lockers and a few showers. Floyd, he took this all in, and he knew he belonged here, though he wasn't quite ready to tell that to the odd white-haired proprietor. He said, "My old-time embarrassment kept me from it for a while. It wasn't the fear of getting hurt, it was the fear of starting something new." So he just watched his brothers go through the drills. Patterson was now 14, already closing in on 6 feet tall, but weighing just 147 pounds, with rounded shoulders and long, straw, thin arms. But he had learned, at the Carlton Branch YMCA, and during scuffles at school, that he could actually hit. After watching his older brothers work out a few times, he approached D'Amato and said he wanted to fight. D'Amato was definitely interested. Lavelle had already told Cus that Floyd might have the right stuff to become a pro. Cus asked him how old he was. Fearing he might get turned away for being too young, Floyd fibbed, telling Cus he was 15. D'Amato agreed to give him a shot at boxing and explained what the deal would be. He would allow Patterson to train at the Gramercy, provide him socks, trunks, t-shirts, a no-foul protector and the other equipment he would need, and permit him to spar with the other Gramercy boys, all at no charge, with the understanding that D'Amato would be Patterson's manager, guide his career, and, if he turned pro, claim a percentage of his purses. None of this was written down, but Floyd accepted the offer, and the spindly Bed-Stuy kid became one of D'Amato's protégés. No relationship was more important in shaping Floyd's life. During his heyday in the 1950s and 60s, Constantine Cus D'Amato was a mysterious figure to sports writers and boxing fans alike. No one doubted that he was a veteran of the rough-and-tumble boxing scene in New York, though he never fought professionally himself. But whence he came and why he wound up doing what he did seemed to be anyone's guess. Newspaper accounts of the time sometimes mentioned that he had no family and suggested his age was unknown. In fact, he did have family, and his birthday was available. He was born on January the 17th, 1908, to Italian immigrants living in a tenement in the Bronx Class and Point section. His father was Damiano D'Amato, a one-time Italian folk wrestler who loved boxing. Damiano was a strong-willed man who taught himself to read and write as an adult. He passed on that willpower to his sons. Cus's mother, Elizabeth, died of pneumonia not long after his 5th birthday. Cus said, "I don't remember my mother, and I was fortunate because I was self-reliant at a very early age. I was not confused by the ideas, the thoughts of mothers and fathers who, well-meaning though they may be, mess up the minds of the children. This world he encountered outside of the D'Amato home was difficult too. Now, to hear more stories on Cus D'Amato, please go back and listen to our career profile on the man himself. Cus said, "The first thing I do with a young fighter is explain fear. Most people don't know much about fear. They think it's a sign of being yellow. But fear is normal. It's like fire. If you let it get out of control, it will destroy you and everything around you. If you can learn how to control it, you can make it work for you. Fear is just nature's way of preparing you to fight." D'Amato soon had the opportunity to teach Patterson his first lesson in confronting fear. Floyd trained at Gramercy Gym for a couple of weeks, awkwardly trying to mimic the things he'd seen his brother Frank do in the ring. When D'Amato decided it was time for Floyd to attempt some serious sparring, he paired Patterson with an experienced boxer, Frank. For his part, Frank Patterson believed Floyd had no business trying to box. Frank knew his little brother would cry if you hit him too hard. So Frank was not shy about taking young Floyd to school in the ring. At one point, Floyd stepped into the pocket to fire some close-range punches at Frank, but he made the novice mistake of failing to hold his right hand high enough to protect his head. Frank uncorked a hard left hook to Floyd's temple that sent the younger Patterson staggering. After taking the blow, Floyd wanted nothing more than to escape the ring as fast as he could. His head spinning, he fled to the locker room and began to cry. Presently, D'Amato was standing over him. Typical, the no-nonsense tough guy D'Amato had a gentle, nurturing side, and at that moment he revealed it to Floyd, assuring Patterson that getting tagged with a hook happened to many kids attempting to box for the first time. D'Amato did not dismiss Floyd as a crybaby, not man enough for boxing, as many managers probably would have done. Instead, what he did do was he encouraged Floyd to keep trying. He knew what Floyd was up against. He said, "Boxing is 75% psychological and only 25% physical." Patterson responded to D'Amato's psychological ministrations in the same way he had to Vivian Costans at Wiltwick. He was determined to prove that D'Amato's faith in him was not misplaced. The bond between manager and fighter was set. Patterson's confidence increased as, under D'Amato's tutelage, he picked up the rudiments of boxing. Just 6 months after Patterson began training under him, Cus decided it was time for Floyd's first amateur bout. Patterson would fight under the auspices of D'Amato's Empire Sports Club, which was an accredited member of the New York Metropolitan Amateur Athletic Union. At his stated age of 15 years old and weighing 147 pounds, Floyd Patterson would compete in the sub-novice class of a city AAU tournament for his first fight. It occurred at an old boxing club in Queens, and Floyd won without breaking a sweat. His opponent failed to show. Still, it was a victory. He now had an amateur record of 1-0. This so-called win advanced him to the tournament's second round, held at the Downtown Athletic Club. There, with Cus and his brother Nick D'Amato working his corner along with Frank Lavelle, Floyd faced a full-grown Navy man. Patterson made a typical novice mistake when he gave in to the adrenaline rush prompted by the bell and began throwing punches wildly through the first round. Sensing he had a chance to defeat an inexperienced kid, the Navy man came at Floyd fast and hard in the second round. But somehow, Patterson landed a punch on his opponent's jaw, and the sailor went down. Floyd didn't think he'd hit him all that hard. He'd seen cowboys in movies take what appeared to be much harder punches, and they were able to pop back up and continue slugging. So he expected the sailor to do the same. But Floyd learned the real fights were different. In real fights, you could clip your opponent in just the right place with a relatively short punch, and that would be enough to knock him out. The sailor failed to make it back to his feet before the referee's count ended. Patterson had his first real victory, a knockout, at 34 seconds into the second round. Patterson enjoyed a few days of exuberance before his third tournament fight. On that day, Egged on by his brother Billy, he went for a run in Brooklyn's Prospect Park. That night he felt drained. His opponent had enough ring savvy to understand that Patterson was fatigued, and he beat Floyd handily. Up to that time, Floyd and Billy had an uneasy relationship at best. Floyd decided that Billy, who was more knowledgeable about training, had encouraged him to run that day to ensure he lost the contest. Floyd held it against him for years. Floyd lost his next 2 fights as well, but he could not blame his brother for those. Floyd's amateur record stood at 2 wins, and one of those was by way of forfeit against 3 losses. That record would be enough to discourage many kids from continuing, but not Floyd. Boxing was the only thing providing him with a direction in life. He wasn't about to turn his back on it. D'Amato and Lavelle saw the problem with Patterson's ring performances so far. Simply put, he was getting hit too much. So they began schooling Floyd in protecting himself, emphasising an unconventional boxing stance that became known as the peekaboo. Conventional strategy called for a right-handed boxer like Patterson to stand more or less sideways, left shoulder aimed at his opponent, knees bent slightly, feet spread shoulder width apart to provide good balance, and right hand high and close to the chin, with left hand also high but a bit lower than the right, left elbow in tight to protect the midsection, chin tucked into the hollow of the left shoulder. That's a good place to keep it too, observed the great prizefighter Barney Ross, who won world titles in 3 weight divisions. You'll avoid a lot of trouble. In the peekaboo, however, a boxer stood with his gloves cupped around his face, his arms so close that his elbows were nearly touching. This created a kind of shield that the boxer could use to block punches. I call it a tight defence, Cus D'Amato said. It enables you to move in aggressively without leaving any vulnerable openings. But for the stance to be effective, the peekaboo fighter stood squared up to his opponent, and even D'Amato admitted that throwing blows with power from this position was a challenge. Cus also recognised that a peekaboo fighter always faced risk when battling a boxer with a good uppercut. Whatever the peekaboo drawbacks, D'Amato and Lavelle began training Patterson to use the stance to protect himself in the ring. It proved effective, enough so that they could plan to enter Floyd, who in recent months had filled out to become a 160-pound middleweight, into the premier East Coast amateur boxing competition, the 1951 New York Golden Gloves Championships. His losing amateur record be damned, the Gloves tournament was the brainchild of New York Daily News sports editor Paul Gallico, and had been around for nearly 25 years at this point. It proved popular, and other cities began sponsoring their own gloves competitions. These amateur showcases had become spawning grounds for future professional world champions like Barney Ross, Leo Rodak, Ezard Charles, Joey Maxim, Harold Dade, and Wallace Bud Smith. In 1951, 16-year-old Floyd dreamed that his name might be added to that list. The New York tournament's finals occurred at the nation's top boxing venue, Madison Square Garden. This third incarnation of the Garden stood at 50th Street and 8th Avenue, and fighting there was every up-and-coming New York boxer's dream. Two of the Patterson's boxing heroes, Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson, each fought more than 10 pro bouts there. When Patterson walked under the Garden's famous marquee and saw Golden Gloves spelled out on it, he must have known he was entering boxing's big time. But just how well he might do was in question, given his poor amateur record. As it turned out, Lavelle and D'Amato's peekaboo strategy, it worked. It was in the 1951 New York Golden Gloves that Patterson first proved himself to be a boxer likely to have a gilded future. He won his first 4 fights with surprising ease, and this is what he said about that time. I was credited with 2 third-round technical knockouts when the referee stopped my first 2 bouts of the tournament to save my opponents from further punishment. The next 2 fights ended even faster. Then, on February the 19th, 1951, he faced Richie Hill, a Police Athletic League fighter for the New York Middleweight Championship. A crowd of 12,233 gathered in the Garden to watch, including the mayor, the police commissioner, the district attorney, and former world heavyweight champion, Gene Tunney. The bout went the distance. After the final bell, the decision was announced, and Floyd Patterson was New York's middleweight Golden Gloves champion. Patterson scarcely had time to celebrate. As the city's middleweight champ, he qualified to take part in the Eastern Golden Gloves Championships. On February the 28th, winners of elimination fights held earlier in various cities in the East and Puerto Rico battled at Madison Square Garden. Patterson displayed ever-growing confidence and boxing skills in the Eastern Golden Gloves, even winning one fight with just 3 punches thrown during the first 22 seconds. In the 3-round Garden final, he decisioned John Gibson from Syracuse to claim his second amateur title. This win set him up to compete for what was essentially the national amateur crown. The Intercity Golden Gloves tournament pitted winners from the Eastern tournament, as in the New York team, against the winners from the Western tournament, the Chicago team. By 1951, a bitter rivalry had existed between the two squads. That year, they clashed in New York, with the finals at Madison Square Garden scheduled for March 19th. Patterson and the other New York winners travelled upstate to train at Bear Mountain Inn on the Hudson River before returning home to fight their rivals. Floyd went into the tournament with good press behind him. Writers were impressed by his speed, his power and toughness, and especially by his left hook, a power shot he threw while lunging. The Lowell MA's son called Patterson one of the best men on the East's team. He was favoured to win, but he faced one of the best boxers ever to compete in the Golden Gloves, Richard Guerrero. About 5 years older than Patterson, Guerrero was a local legend in Chicago. He had already claimed 2 lightweight championships in 1948 and 49 in the New York-Chicago rivalry, and after skipping the 1950 Golden Gloves, he'd moved up to middleweight, hoping to become the first fighter in gloves history to win 3 titles. Guerrero fought as a southpaw, which was always a challenge for a right-hander like Patterson. Guerrero's left-hand tactics did frustrate Patterson. The older fighter moved with lightning speed as he delivered smashing blows to Patterson's body, then effectively blocked Patterson's attempts at counterpunching. Halfway through the fight, Guerrero shifted into a right-handed stance, adding to Patterson's mounting frustration. Floyd was the favourite to win, but Guerrero wound up with an easy victory, leaving Patterson confused as he tried to understand how things went so wrong. More success did follow, but there was also disappointment that lay ahead. In the spring, Floyd made it to the semi-final round of the AAU National Boxing Championships in Boston, but he fell to defeat in the semis. Still, at age 16, Patterson had proved that D'Amato and Lavelle's faith in him as a prospect was not misplaced. As a newcomer to New York's fiercely competitive amateur boxing scene, Patterson had made his mark. His premiere in the Golden Gloves competitions was just one victory shy of a spectacular one. Patterson and his handlers knew he had a way to go to succeed against boxers of Dick Guerrero's calibre. Floyd had looked exhausted at the end of the Guerrero fight, so improving his stamina through road work became his highest priority. Running took on a new purpose for him, and he remained until his final days a dedicated runner. Lavelle oversaw some of Patterson's most challenging road work, picking him up early on Saturday mornings and taking him to Coney Island. There, the trainer instructed him to run on the sandy beach to strengthen his ankles, calves and thighs. It wasn't easy, but the older man convinced Patterson it was necessary to develop the leg power he needed in the ring. On other mornings, Patterson ran closer to home. He did his road work before dawn, often accompanied by his uncle Charlie Johnson, in Prospect Park. He chugged along in army shoes, long underwear, overalls and a hooded sweatshirt. With each step, he reminded himself that boxing could be the financial salvation for him and his family. Patterson's dedication to training was unmatched. He trained everywhere, even when he wasn't at the Gramercy gym or clicking away the miles in Prospect Park. At home, he locked himself in the bathroom and shadow boxed in front of the mirror, occasionally throwing jabs at the string hanging from the old-fashioned light fixture. He even employed paper bags and pillows as makeshift punching bags. Though he claimed boxing was his only concern, Floyd was still a teenager and found some time to hang out with other neighbourhood kids. Through one of his buddies, he met a girl who had a pretty smile and who seemed to be about as shy as he was. Sandra Elizabeth Hicks was her name, and Floyd guessed she was about his age. The Hicks family lived on Bainbridge Street not far from his maternal grandmother's house. With Sandra so close by, Floyd suddenly found a reason to visit his grandmother much more often. He started running into Sandra on his way to his grandmother's just as he'd hoped he would. It didn't take long before his visits to Bainbridge Street were directed towards visiting Sandra and Sandra alone. It took a while, but Patterson shared snippets of his past life with his new friend, if not the whole story. He feared she might think he was stupid. He also hid details about his family, such as just how many brothers and sisters he had, and even the address of his apartment the Pattersons called home. The Hicks family were not affluent, but they were better off than the Pattersons, and Floyd thought she might break things off with him if she found out. But when she learned about all these things, and also about his time at Wilwick and his experiences at PS 614, none of it seemed to bother Sandra. She introduced Patterson to her parents, who were impressed by his polite demeanour. Eventually, Floyd worked up enough nerve to ask Mrs. Hicks if Sandra could be his guest at one of his fights. Mrs. Hicks responded by saying, over Sandra's protests, "Do you have any idea how old Sandra is?" "No, Mrs. Hicks," Patterson said. "Sandra and I have never discussed that." "Floyd, Sandra's only 13. Floyd left the house that night knowing that if he were to have a relationship with Sandra, it would have to develop more slowly than he first thought. The good news was that Mrs. Hicks had not prohibited Patterson from seeing Sandra. She said, "You're a gentlemanly young man." The exposure to the Hicks family affected Patterson in a way beyond the potential for romance with Sandra. They were devout Roman Catholics, and Sandra attended parochial school. At the time, Floyd was not particularly religious, and the Baptist Patterson family seldom attended church. But his involvement with the pretty girl with the straight white teeth stirred a spiritual awakening in Floyd. After witnessing her displays of sweetness and decency time and time again, he began to wonder if her faith made her who she was. He and Sandra began to discuss religion frequently. Eventually, she took him to her church's parish house and introduced Floyd to the priest. Floyd said he wanted to start catechism classes. As Patterson studied the teachings of Roman Catholicism, he continued Cus D'Amato's ring catechism to prepare for whatever boxing offered him next. No one could have been more surprised than Floyd at what turned out to be next. The 614 principal, Alex Miller, called Floyd aside and asked what he wanted to do with his life. "I want to fight," Patterson said. I want to be a professional boxer." "Why would you want to do that, Floyd?" Miller asked. "It's the quickest way I know to start earning some money to help out my family." Patterson was about to turn 17. PS 614 was in essence a vocational grammar school for troubled students. After graduating, he would have nothing more than an 8th grade education. 2 options lay ahead for him: go to work or continue his education at a vocational high school. The prospect of high school could not have been very appealing to Floyd, given his age. He would have been about 21 before he finished. More than anything, he wanted money, and he wanted it now. Money for himself, money for his family, money to spend on Sandra Hicks. He juggled the options: backbreaking work at some dead-end job for low pay, further education that might lead to something financially rewarding years down the line, and prize fighting. For Floyd, it wasn't a hard decision. During the 1951 holiday season, Floyd approached Cus about turning pro. He wanted to start bringing some money home from the ring. Cus listened patiently and advised Patterson not to give up on amateur competition just yet. Floyd was surprised. Didn't D'Amato think he was good enough to fight pro? Of course he was good enough, D'Amato said with conviction, but if he turned pro, he wouldn't be able to qualify for the 1952 American Olympic boxing team. The Olympics. It was the first time anyone had mentioned the games to Floyd. He didn't understand how competing in the Olympics could actually benefit him. Jesse Owens had become a hero for black Americans after his remarkable 4 gold medal performance in Berlin in 1936. But Owens' background wasn't quite like Floyd's. Owens and his family had struggled to get by in one of Cleveland's poor black neighborhoods until Owens' track skills opened the door for him to attend Ohio State University, and that changed everything. He became a college man, and American Olympic teams of the day were dominated by college men. Amateur athletes, by and large, still looked down on the scruffy sorts who took money to participate in sports. Floyd was perplexed by D'Amato's thinking. His goal was to make money, and he couldn't see how the Olympics would lead to dollars in his pocket. But he had put his trust in this enigma of a manager. If D'Amato's plans included an Olympic tryout, Patterson would follow them. He decided to extend his amateur career into 1952, while taking classes at a vocational high school. Floyd began his Olympic quest in February of 1952. A return to the New York Golden Gloves competition at Madison Square Garden was his first stop. Patterson by now had grown taller and filled out some since his previous Golden Gloves appearance, so D'Amato determined he should fight in the light heavyweight division at 175 pounds. Patterson liked battling the heavier boxers who fought more slowly than he. He sliced his way through his 3 opponents in the Golden Gloves with first-round knockouts. His championship bout lasted just 40 seconds. In March came the Eastern Golden Gloves Championships again at the Garden. Patterson easily defeated his first opponent, and then, using what was becoming his trademark looping left hook, because he often leaps while throwing it, both feet off the mat, it became known as Patterson's Gazelle Punch. Floyd TKO'd Newark's Harold Carter to claim the Eastern title. During the 3rd week of March 1952, Patterson competed in the Intercity Golden Glove tournament, winning the light heavyweight title. D'Amato had designs on Patterson's winning the National Amateur Athletic Union Championship that spring in Boston as well. But he determined that Patterson's approach to this year's tournament should be different from the previous one. He and Patterson agreed that Floyd should go to Boston without the distraction of schoolwork. So Patterson, who'd graduated from PS 614 a month earlier, decided to stop attending the metalworking classes he was taking at Alexander Hamilton Vocational High School. In Floyd's mind, there was a right way and a wrong way to take that step. Because of his past reputation as a truant, he did not want to simply drop out. He wanted to secure working papers first. Hotelier Charles Schwefel, an acquaintance of D'Amato's and a supporter of PS 614, gave Floyd a job at the Gramercy Park Hotel, and that allowed Patterson to get the document he desired. Floyd put in time at that hotel, but it was always clear to Schwefel and everyone else involved that his real job was training to box. Schwefel freed him from his hotel responsibilities for fights, including his travel to Boston to train for the national AAUs. Floyd went down in weight for the AAUs, fighting as a middleweight. It was a bold move given that middleweight was a much more hotly contested class than light heavyweight. It was all a part of D'Amato's plan to mould Floyd into a versatile boxer, one who could bang with heavier boxers but also match the speed of lighter ones. The middleweight competition caused Floyd no problems. He hammered his way to the finals. On April 9th at the Boston Garden, he won the AAU championship with a knockout. Of his 4 matches in the tournament, 3 had ended with his opponents on the mat, and Floyd was named Outstanding Boxer in the AAU tournament. With the Golden Glove titles and now a win at the AAUs, he moved into the ranks of the American amateur boxing's elite, poised to claim a spot on the Olympic team bound for Helsinki, Finland. Patterson competed as a heavy middleweight in the Olympic qualifying tournament. The winners of 8 sectional qualification competitions for AAU boxers were to receive an invitation to compete in the Kansas City finals in late May. The NCAA, as well as the Army and Navy champions, were also invited to Kansas City. Patterson fought in the sectional tournament held in Albany, where he stole the show at Hawkins Stadium, according to the Berkshire MA Evening Eagle. The paper's reporter noted that Patterson stalks like Joe Louis and came to the New York State Capitol with a reputation of a future champion. Floyd proved that reputation was warranted as he scored consecutive technical knockouts. Amazingly, both TKOs occurred precisely at 1 minute, 38 seconds of the opening rounds. At the finals in Kansas City, Patterson continued his string of impressive wins, racking up more knockouts on his way to the title match. On June 18th, he stopped NCAA boxing champion Gordon Gladson with a hard left hook. Awarded a technical knockout, Patterson became an Olympian. "I beat a college guy, me, who had trouble getting through grammar school," he said. The 1952 squad was by far the best Olympic boxing team the US had ever dispatched to the International Sports Festival. Dr. Barry Barradale of Houma, Louisiana, managed the boxing Olympians, and he boldly predicted that the Americans would win 4 gold medals. The team's 2 coaches, P. Mello, who mentored New York Catholic Youth Organization boxers, and J.T. Owen, who headed the boxing program at Louisiana State University, agreed. But all 3 knew their changes would have to take a different approach from previous American Olympic teams if the team were to harvest many medals. Past American Olympic teams in Olympic competition faced unfamiliarity with international boxing rules, and Barradale said, "We've lost many a chance at titles in the last 2 games because of minor infractions. The referee warns you once for something like not taking a full step back on the break. Then, if you hit and hold or push off on the break, or bob and weave below the waist, then they can disqualify you, and do, for the second violation." In the 1948 games, Washington Jones knocked a guy cold and then was disqualified from hitting with an open glove. Barradale's fighters, while supremely talented, would have to be disciplined enough to avoid tripping over the rules if they were to win medals. That became the focus of the training. As for the potential gold medalists, Barradale saw coming out of the games, he included Floyd. He said, "Floyd Patterson is out of this world. He knocked out all 8 of his opponents in the 165-pound trials. Brother, if he doesn't win, the guy who beats him will have to be somewhat super special." Floyd joined 300 other American Olympians for a grand departure celebration in New York, which included a Lower Manhattan ticker tape parade, a reception at City Hall, and a luncheon at the Waldorf Astoria. Events all new and wonderful for the kid from Brooklyn. The Pan Am plane began its descent. From his seat, 17-year-old Floyd could see evergreen forest extending to the horizon. There was one clearing, and the plane was slowly flying into it. The plane touched down around sunset, and Floyd joined the other American Olympians in exiting the aircraft. It was an extraordinary experience for him. While other American teenagers were engaged in summer vacations and thoughts of the upcoming school year, Floyd was preparing to represent his country while battling the best amateur boxers from around the globe. On the drive into Helsinki from the airport, he sensed he was entering a place far different from anything he'd known, a city that looked ancient and yet seemed almost like a frontier community. He'd later say it was an experience he could never forget. When he arrived at the camp, he received his Olympic uniform. His, like everyone else's on the American team, was all red, white and blue. Barradale assigned Mello to be Patterson's Olympic trainer, and Mello filled the role more than adequately as Patterson attempted to digest the odd rules the Olympics imposed on boxers. Patterson also made a friend of fellow New Yorker Tony Anthony, a member of the American boxing team. Once in Helsinki, the 2 fighters spent their free time exploring the Olympic Village and beyond. One day, they passed the Soviet team as it worked out, and Floyd saw firsthand just how different an approach the Eastern Europeans took towards boxing compared with the Americans. The Soviets stood in a line wearing matching blue sweatshirts. Their trainer shouted a command, and the boxers responded in unison, throwing jabs. Another command, and the Soviets all threw rights. Patterson was surprised by how mechanical and ineffective it all seemed. He dismissed the Soviets as not being that much of a threat to the Americans, but he did worry about the Finns. Not the Finnish athletes, but the people who called Finland home. When Patterson and Anthony roamed the Helsinki streets, they saw that many residents lived in poverty, as dire as that in Bed-Stuy. By contrast, the athletes in the Olympic Village were treated to spreads of food, the likes of which Floyd had never witnessed in his life. The discrepancy between the hungry Finnish host and the pampered visiting athletes troubled him, as he recalled, the many nights he himself went to bed hungry as a child. He decided to do something about it. He began helping himself to extra food from the Olympic Village cafeteria lines, sometimes taking as many as 3 or 4 steaks. He'd then make up little packages containing the extra food, which he'd pass on to Finns he'd meet on the street. Mello saw him doing this and was dumbfounded. "I'm in this business 41 years, he said, and this is the nicest kid I've ever handled." In the Olympic boxing ring at the arena called the Messahalle, however, Patterson was anything but nice. Red Smith saw him in action there and was mightily impressed by the young fighter with, in his words, paws faster than a subway pickpocket. Writing at the time for the New York Herald Tribune, Smith had a reputation as America's most literary daily newspaper sports columnist. Receiving favourable notice from Smith boosted the career of any athlete. But Smith went beyond merely mentioning Patterson. He devoted a whole column to the young boxer, the first lengthy piece of journalism about Floyd. The Herald Tribune had a national readership itself, but Smith's column was also syndicated to dozens of other papers around the country. His piece on Patterson helped make Floyd's name familiar to sports fans nationwide. It was clear to Smith and other reporters in Helsinki that Patterson was far more talented than the international boxers he faced. Floyd did, however, struggle against the rules which favoured European-style orthodox boxing over the looser, more improvisational American-style boxing. In one fight, Floyd drew a warning for simply throwing a left hook, then crouching, a standard tactic in American boxing. The European referee could have disqualified him for 2 more such infractions, but Patterson safely finished the fight, scoring a win. Floyd defeated fighters from France, the Netherlands and Sweden to advance to the gold medal round. The other finalist was a Romanian named Vasile Tita. Given the tenure of the Cold War era, Patterson guessed he would have a difficult time defeating a Soviet bloc fighter with a Soviet bloc referee making rules, decisions, and a large pro-Soviet contingency in the audience shouting its approval. So, he was determined to knock out Tita, removing any possibility of hanky-panky in the judging. And Patterson did just that. Easily, as it turned out. Just 20 seconds after the opening bell, Floyd landed a crisp right uppercut on Tita's chin, knocking out the Romanian and securing the gold medal for himself. After a blur of congratulations and impromptu celebration, he found himself on the Olympic platform with a gold medal around his neck and a bouquet of flowers in his arms. After the conclusion of the Star-Spangled Banner, he bowed to the cheering crowd, the first time he'd ever bowed to anyone, he would later claim. Overwrought with emotion, he bowed and bowed and bowed again, until someone told him enough was enough. Floyd was part of a spectacular showing for the 1952 American boxing team. For the first time in nearly half a century, 5 American boxers made it to the Olympic finals, and all 5 claimed gold medals. No other country came close to claiming that much boxing gold that year, and all 5 of these men were African American, hailing from all across the country: Brooklyn, Cleveland, Washington DC, Gary, Indiana, and the Watts neighbourhood of Los Angeles. It was a significant event in African American history, though hardly recognised as such at the time or since. Had it happened a few years later, it would no doubt be compared to Texas Western's defeating Kentucky for the 1966 NCAA basketball championship. In that game, the Texas Western Miners played 5 black starters against the Wildcats' 5 white starters and won 72-65. The Miners' victory has been celebrated as a milestone in the fight to integrate college sports ever since. In 1952, 5 black Americans entered the ring on the world stage, and all 5 emerged as champions, winning for their country its greatest Olympic boxing triumph. But the champions' race went largely unremarked upon in an America in the grips of a Red Scare, an America where most schools were segregated and blacks were expected to know their place. Arriving back at New York International Airport, at Idlewild, the 5 champions lined up with Barradale and Mello for a photograph. In it, most of the fighters are beaming, but Patterson has a stare of determination locked on his face. After the picture, reporters approached him and asked if his next step was to turn pro. Patterson had 45 amateur fights under his belt now, golden gloves and AAU titles, and now an Olympic gold medal. If he never fought another bout, he would go down in history as one of a dozen or so of the best amateur boxers America had ever produced. He knew he wasn't ready to stop now. He knew he wanted to fight for money, but he didn't share that. He looked over at the barrel-chested, white-haired man who, along with his former teacher, Vivian Costin, had come to greet him at the airport. Cus answers the questions, Floyd told reporters. The teenage Floyd Patterson returned home to Brooklyn as a history maker, but the home he went back to was a run-down, crowded apartment in a crime-ridden ghetto. Even though newspapers carried accounts of his amateur boxing heroics during the previous 2 years, he had earned no money whatsoever from sports, except from the pittance Charles Schwefel paid him for his part-time work at the Gramercy Park Hotel, plus some cash from manual labour jobs here and there. He had nothing to contribute to the family coffers, and the Pattersons seemed as financially desperate as ever. He seldom had dollars for dates or to purchase small holiday presents for his girlfriend Sandra. The situation was frustrating for him, and he was ready to turn pro as soon as possible to do something about it. D'Amato agreed it was time. Cus had directed Floyd's amateur career masterfully to ready him for a professional career. Patterson had fought in 4 different weight classes, giving him experience against opponents ranging from fleet-footed lightweights to hard-slugging light heavyweights. He'd also squared off against boxers from different parts of the United States and from Europe, all employing different stances and styles, all of which had seasoned Floyd for what he would face in New York's bloody prize-fighting halls. Not long after Patterson returned from Finland, D'Amato took the steps necessary for Floyd to turn pro. First on D'Amato's agenda was drawing up a formal written contract under which Cus would manage Floyd's career as it moved forward. With character that ran so deep, D'Amato said publicly, it was plain that Floyd's word and faith were more important than a contract. That was fine as far as an amateur career went, but bitter experience had taught D'Amato that when money is involved, agreements should be in writing and signed. Early in his career at the Gramercy gym, D'Amato had schooled a talented middleweight by the name of Rocky Graziano, but Cus failed to sign Graziano to a contract and lost his boxer to different management with deep mob connections. D'Amato sourly watched as Graziano won the world middleweight title in 1947 and never missed an opportunity to dismiss him thereafter as a gutless bum who couldn't fight. D'Amato was not about to let that happen again with one of his fighters, so he insisted Floyd sign a contract. The contract essentially gave D'Amato complete control and significantly excluded the man who had discovered Floyd, Frank Lovell. For the time being, it appeared things would continue as they had been for Lovell. He would still participate in training Patterson and would work his corner during fights. Only now he'd get paid for his efforts, but he was in fact a marked man in terms of Floyd's long-term future. D'Amato was under no illusion about just where the Gramercy stood in the hierarchy of the New York boxing gyms. He knew it was second tier and lacked the quality of sparring partners Floyd needed to develop into a first-rate pro. He also knew that Patterson needed better training than either he or Lovell or anyone else at the Gramercy could provide. So shortly after he signed Floyd, Cus took his young fighter to Stillman's gym, which occupied a soot-covered 3-story building just a short walk from Madison Square Garden. The most successful prize fighters worked out here under the stern gaze of the very best trainers in the world. It was here that D'Amato hired the man who would mould Floyd into a contender. Dan Florio seemed to have been around the New York fight scene forever. As early as the 1920s, he was refereeing fights on the East Coast, after which he turned his focus to training. He worked with the best. With his brother Nick, he coached Tony Canzonieri, battling Battolino, Pete Scalzo, and Freddie Miller to world titles. He also had been responsible for resurrecting the career of Jersey Joe Walcott, working the corner in the infamous 1947 title fight in which Walcott floored Joe Louis in the 4th round and seemed to completely dominate the rest of the fight, but lost the decision to Lewis. Florio was so verbose, so naturally the hands hanging around Stillman's called him silent. His brother, who almost never talked, became known as Gabby. For the next dozen years, Silent and sometimes Gabby seconded Patterson in key fights. But at first, Silent took one look at Patterson and, discounting Floyd's stellar amateur career and Olympic gold medal, he said to D'Amato, "He has to learn everything. His stance. He fights with his legs too far apart. He hops around all the time. He jumps like a kangaroo and throws a right. He don't keep his hands up." D'Amato charged Florio, not Lavelle, with fixing all that. From the beginning, Floyd wanted to look good at Stillman's. The important managers, matchmakers and promoters in the gallery eyed all the fighters, trying to determine who had heart, who didn't, who was being brought along by their trainers at just the right pace and who was being pushed too fast. The impressions a boxer made on these men, leaning forward in their filthy folding chairs, overcoats securely tucked under their arms, could affect the whole course of a career. A bad showing would stay burnt in their memories for years, preventing a fighter from getting plum spots on a lucrative fight card. One day at Stillman's, Charlie Goldman, who trained Rocky Marciano, approached Floyd and asked if he could go a few rounds with a new fighter Goldman was working with at the time, Tommy Harrison. Patterson wasn't so sure he was ready for that. Harrison was one of Marciano's regular sparring partners, and he was taller and heavier than Patterson. And he was fast, nearly as fast as Floyd himself. Patterson told Goldman to ask D'Amato, who was cautiously bringing Floyd along, not rushing him to spar fighters substantially better than he. D'Amato, to Patterson's surprise, he gave the OK. Early in the first round, Harrison unloaded 12 unanswered jabs, most landing in spite of Patterson's bobbing and weaving. Those blows hurt Floyd, even though Harrison wore padded sparring gloves. In all his amateur career, even for fighting the championships of the AAU and the Olympics, Floyd never encountered punches as hard as these. It was a brutal introduction to just what Floyd could expect as a pro. The eyes of the Stillman's contingent locked onto Patterson as he took those heavy shots. Would the kid collapse? Patterson knew he had to do something. He timed Harrison's next big jab. When it arrived, Patterson threw a stiff right cross above it, tagging Harrison in the face. The experienced pro staggered. After that, Floyd pursued Harrison, firing combinations that Harrison struggled to ward off. The men in the folding chairs nodded their approval, happy with how Floyd had overcome adversity, transforming it into an advantage. A buzz began to spread around New York about D'Amato's up-and-comer, a kid who someday, soon, just might be good enough to put in the ring with the likes of Sugar Ray Robinson. And that brings an end to the first part of Floyd Patterson's career profile. So, just to summarise, we've got his early beginnings, we understand how he's got into the sport, we've looked at his amateur accolades, and I didn't realise there was as many amateur accolades as what there was in Floyd's career. He was an Olympic gold medalist in the 1952 Games, and we're now at a point where he's just ready to turn professional, which is a good way to end this first part before we move into his pro career and everything that precedes. So, if you've enjoyed this first part of the Floyd Patterson career profile, please do let us know on social media. If you're on Facebook, you can get us at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. If you're on X, it's career_profiles. If you're on TikTok or Instagram, it's at BTR Boxing Podcast. If you're listening on Spotify, please make sure you leave a comment below. The comments function is getting better on there. I am now able to reply to a lot of those comments. So please, if you've enjoyed the first part, please do let me know. If you're listening on Apple and you've enjoyed this and previous episodes and you've not left a rating and a review, please go and do that also. It really is appreciated. If you're listening on a podcast app that has a rating system, a review system or a comment section, please do go and leave a comment. I do pick them up and I will make you aware of them on this podcast. I will give you shout outs. Please make sure you do let us know what you think of the episodes as they're developing. So, Part 2, we're going to go into his pro career. We're going to talk about some of the early notable fights in his career, some of the stories, some of the most notable names as we start to go through the depths of what his career meant to him. Now remember, he had a long career, so this means that there is going to be more than 2 parts. It is going to be around a 3-4 part episode on Floyd Patterson, and I hope that splitting it down into smaller chunks like this is beneficial to you guys. So, again, as I've said, we're at a point now, it's just about to turn pro, and it's a good way to end part 1. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of the Floyd Patterson career profile on the BTR Boxing Podcast Network.